told to pick it up if I don't. Thank you, Carlos. My name is Melinda Hinkson. There are many of you who I have not met before. Fantastic to have you here at the Institute. Thanks very much for coming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on Wurundjeri land, and in doing so, noting that we're talking about disasters of the present, of the recent past, and of the future. I think it's also appropriate that we note the ongoing disaster of colonialism and Aboriginal people's multiple creative responses to that, both here locally and around the country. I just have the very simple pleasure of introducing our really remarkable panel for you tonight, and it's a panel that's been put together by Gemma, who's visiting us from Manchester and came and saw us at the Institute very soon after she arrived. And Gemma has been very energetically and excitingly supported by Carlos, I think, in the kind of searching out of this really interesting range of people that we've got together for you tonight. Come through. So very briefly, we have, first of all, I'll introduce people in the order in which they're going to speak. So Gemma, sitting beside me here, is a development geographer based in the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Unit. Response Institute at the University of Manchester. Very interesting sounding institute. She researches the everyday lived experiences of disaster affected people, principally in the Caribbean, and the micropolitics of international development partnerships in post-colonial societies. Gemma is particularly interested in how these experiences can be communicated to a public, and communication is a really big theme of what we're on about here tonight, in engaging, thoughtful and socially responsible ways. And Gemma has just published a graphic novella titled After Maria, Everyday Recovery from Disaster, based on research about family recovery after Hurricane Irma in Puerto Rico. Our second speaker, and we extend him a very warm welcome, is Michael Fikaris, a multidisciplinary freelance comic artist who works locally and internationally with groups including Refugee Art Project, Animatism Art and Polyglot. As a community-driven project leader, Michael has been publishing comic artist anthologies since 2002 under the name Silent Army Comic Collective. In 2017, he was awarded the Platinum Ledger Award for Outstanding Service to Australian Comics. Next, we have Dr. Jenn Wray, an artist-researcher of Canadian Métis Scottish descent. Jenn is a practice-led research scholar with expertise in what she describes as the discursive field of contemporary environmental art and arts-based environmental communication. She works on and with multi-platform creative projects, transdisciplinary collaborative methods, and through community alliances. Jenn is the director and creative lead of Fair Share Fair, where art, performance, disaster preparedness, and cookery collide into positive disruption. She's a board member of the Australian Creative Recovery Network and the International Environmental Communication Association. And Jenn has lectured at University of Melbourne and Deakin University. And finally, if I can turn over my piece of paper, we have Kate Sulan, a performance maker, director, dramaturge and facilitator. Kate is the founding artistic director of Raucous, an award-winning theatre company that brings together performers with and without disability. Kate is working on the 5-year Refuge project, which some of you no doubt will be quite familiar with, that's being run out of Arts House just around the corner here. And Refuge, for those of you who don't know it, explores the role of artists and cultural institutions in times of climate catastrophe, bringing together emergency management, artists, the community, and local, regional and international partners. Kate has also collaborated with Back to Back Theatre over many years and as a co-deviser, dramaturge and director. So quite an interesting panel. We're going to hear from each of them with whatever they care to present. for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have plenty of time for interaction and discussion after that. So please make them all welcome.
Okie dokie, thank you everybody for coming out tonight on Halloween. So it's I know it was a big decision between coming here and trick-or-treating, so I really appreciate everybody being here. I'm going to read from paper, which I don't normally do, but I was a bit conscious of trying to remember everything, especially because it's being recorded. I don't want to fluff my lines, basically, so bear with me. And I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about what Melinda pointed to, which is the linkage between colonialism and disasters. I mean, it's particularly fitting because we're in the Post-Colonial Institute. So disasters, they take a disproportionate toll on the world's poorest and indigenous communities, many of which are still struggling with the legacies of Western colonialism and neo-colonial practices. But disaster studies, which is my field of work, and policy, tends to really overlook the social, political, economic and cultural conditions that develop over time and which make a society more vulnerable to hazards in the first place. So in effect, in the field of work I'm in, a disaster is often seen as an event isolated in time because it's not a look back to history and how history has shaped the vulnerability of a society. So post-colonial analyses allow us to reframe the question of what is a disaster, what are the causes of disaster, and how do we go about recovering a society after a disaster in post-colonial context. So I do my work in the Caribbean, and you can only really understand disasters by recognizing that some Caribbean states are among the most indebted globally, and that this indebtedness is traceable to colonialism and imperialism. So wealth expropriation from former colonies during the period of early colonialism has undermined Caribbean nations' capacity to reduce the impacts of monsoons, which are increasing in the area, and their ability to recover from these hazards. And then perversely, this resource extraction, which fueled industrialization in former colonial powers, is now the product is now producing the climate change emissions, which are causing greater impacts in former colonies. So, but the ways to mitigate or recover from a disaster are often seen as a technical problem. They're completely removed, they completely overlook this social political history. So the ideas of how do we address disasters is to engineer a dam, create early warning systems. So this history is really erased. There's no tendency to look back at the roots of a disaster having its roots in colonialism. So a post-colonial approach to disaster recovery can allow us to really recognize the collective trauma and the long-term injustice of disaster-affected people. It allows us to move beyond these technocratic approaches by acknowledging the legacies of empire. And that's something that I think a post-colonial approach is really important to doing, is widening the temporal view of what causes a disaster. So post-colonial analyses start from the position that disaster preparedness and recovery should be contextualized in colonial histories and taken a much more radical form. Because industrialized countries have benefited significantly from the processes that cause climate change, they owe a considerable climate debt, and many have argued for that in the form of reparations or climate reparations for former colonies. So these reparations could be in the form of wiping out debt, financial support for climate change adaptation, sending climate change adaptation and disaster reduction experts to support projects, or simply reducing carbon emissions. Or in the context of settler nations such as Australia, returning land to Indigenous communities and ensuring the survival of Indigenous cultures. And the idea of reparations, goes beyond that. So now that I've outlined that, they're not completely separate, but I'm gonna go on and talk about the problems within disaster management and disaster studies and how creative practices can really help to address some of those problems. And I should say, for a caveat, I'm not an artist, I would like to say, but I just work with artists and I try to translate my research through different creative practices. So it's fantastic to have Michael, Kate and Jen here today to be able to share their different creative practices and how they can help us to address some of these problems in disaster management and disaster studies. So the area of work I'm in, disaster studies, it often takes this top-down, quick fix intervention approach. So it stems from the idea that the cause of disasters is the product, the hazard. So the focus on trying to understand what causes disaster is how severe is the monsoon, what is the frequency of the monsoon, and then there's this idea that we can automatically extrapolate the impacts on the society by understanding how the characteristics of the hazard. So this again views disasters as a technocratic problem that can only be understood and treated as a problem for scientists, engineers and bureaucrats. But obviously we know from development studies as well that technocracy is really not the answer. And we can look to Indigenous communities as testimony to this. So Indigenous communities have a millennia-long history of responding to social environmental change. They have a high level of local, traditional and historical knowledge about climate change and have observed and adapted to changes to the weather, flora and fauna for centuries. And a lot of this is because they've been displaced off their land and forced or had to adapt to new environments with different flora, different fauna. So technocracy within disaster management overlooks the social dimensions that determine the impact of a hazard, i.e. the vulnerability of a society, which I've just outlined has its roots as far back as colonialism. So narratives about the cause of disasters, the experience of disaster-affected people, and possible solutions are decontextualized, they're ahistoricized, they're depoliticized and really simplified. Outsiders who often lack a human-centered understanding of how people experience disasters and how disaster-affected people want their societies and lives to be recovered are often the ones holding purse strings, designing the solutions. So there's poor engagement with the diverse ways that people experience disasters, emotionally, socially, spiritually, culturally. This is overlooked in the way that disaster management solutions are designed. So this results in a context being misconstrued, and programs to recover societies or to prepare societies for disasters that subjugate people to inappropriate policies which often aren't sustainable or rejected by local populations. Again, I'm sure many of you are aware that visual and even academic representations of disaster-affected people often rely on these orientalizing, dehumanizing portrayals of people as victims with minimal agency, which is akin to a lot of the development studies literature, or the literature on media representations of so-called developing countries and low-income groups. And an obvious example is the so-called Migrant Crisis, where we see pictures of many people in boats. We don't hear about their personalities, we don't hear about their experiences, who they are, their voices, their names. That's a typical thing in how people in the global south are represented. So this is, a reliance on these grand emotional discourses of pity and compassion, which entrench these problematic hierarchies between the global north and the global south, infantilize people, and again, reproduce this really patronizing attitude towards disaster-affected areas. But moving on to creative text, creative practices, I really think there's a space or different creative texts can really address some of these problems. So for theatre plays, comics, drawings, poetry, or even video games, and that's some of the things that the panelists will talk about. They can be powerful sources to address some of these inadequacies in disaster studies, policy, and media. So a tradition in post-colonial studies is to look towards creative texts for alternative ways of understanding and explaining the world, and a way of reimagining solutions to social problems. And one thing that post-colonial studies I think is really useful for is thinking of an alternative way of understanding disasters, an alternative way of understanding the way that people experience disasters. They open up a space to inform such an approach, and they offer epistemological alternatives to the dominant rhetorics through which disasters are framed, and provide new vocabularies for talking about the cause of disasters, lived experience of disasters, and processes of preparedness, recovery, and reconstruction. So, and the panelists will show as well that creative text can challenge, reject, or reconfigure key disaster concepts such as resilience, risk, adaptation, sustainability, and vulnerability. These are all like the main concepts in disaster studies. And if we look at concepts like resilience and sustainability, in disaster-affected literature, policy, resilience is often instrumentalized as the purpose of it is to reduce the impact of a hazard. That's the main purpose of resilience. So it, in a way, it simplifies, or it has a very reductive understanding of what is to be a human. So it says that it's based on the assumption that the most important thing for a person is to reduce the impacts of a hazard. So again, this is based on a really reductive understanding of human aspirations, what the good life may be for somebody, and what they see as important in their lives. So people may have, and they obviously do have, many needs and concerns that fall outside of resilience vernacular and analytical frameworks. You know, they want more than just reducing the impacts of a flood, for example. So in this sense, mainstream definitions within disaster studies, they often strip people of their identities, their personalities, their aspirations. And again, this opens up a space for creating disaster risk reduction policies and programs which, again, misconstrue what people want, what are people's social and cultural aspirations that sit outside definitions of resilience. But creative texts can help us to reimagine futures after a disaster. They're not bound by orthodox resilience vernacular and analytical frameworks. They can create unique perspectives and reinterpret the causes and impacts of disaster. Creative text can create these three-dimensional characters which recognize that people living in, my throat is so dry, that can recognize, it's a cliffhanger. Okay, so, they can create these three-dimensional characters which recognize that disaster-affected people have these complex identities, that they have personalities. And again, this moves towards more ethical representations of disaster-affected people. And beyond this, it forms the basis for human-centered programs that can accommodate the multiple aspirations that disaster-affected people have. So in this way, it's important to work towards more normative understandings of what disaster risk management policies should look like if they're to be locally supported and sustainable. So and I want to outline a few more benefits of creative text before Kate, Jen, and Michael talk. So they offer these legitimate means of communicating really engaging and socially responsible narratives about disasters that can inform public policy. The arts can humanize and add cultural and historical depth to our understanding of disasters. They highlight the personalities, humor, emotional depth, experiences, voices, situated histories, and subjective positions of disaster-affected people that are often subdued in empirical disaster research. They draw attention to the importance of listening to disaster-affected people's voices and ideas, and they allow people's everyday narratives to be expressed in a really accessible, engaging ways. And also creative texts allow us to access metaphysical, emotional, and psychosocial needs of affected communities because they place cultural and endogenous perspectives at its core. And also different creative texts communicate stories in different ways. So a graphic novel or a video game or a painting, they tell stories in different ways, and often they can have very, very strong rhetorical power. They're able to communicate really complex ideas in engaging ways, and they ask the audience, they ask the reader to engage, to apply their agency, rather than it being very didactic and just spoon-feeding you. You're asked to interpret those texts. And I know that everybody on the panel can talk about how it's a more democratic opportunity for people to engage in the work that an academic like myself does. So I created a graphic novella, and I asked the people that I was talking to in Puerto Rico to give me feedback, and they felt so much more comfortable. I felt in giving feedback and saying, no, you didn't get that right, or you misunderstand the situation, when they can physically see themselves in a drawing. They can see the house that's been drawn. So it provides a space for more meaningful participation. Okay, so I'm going to click onto the next slide. And I just wanted to, now that I've outlined that, I want to talk about 2 minutes, that's perfect. Yes, I'm going to whiz through this. It's fine, I only need a minute each anyway. So I've done a bit of research looking at video games, and there's a lot of video games out there now which look at refugees, and they're called serious games. The idea is that you control an avatar who is a refugee, and you cross borders, you navigate going through different countries. And I know we can talk about this in the questions about the problematics of that, turning a refugee into a video game. But I want to talk about the technology of video games. They have what's known as possibility spaces, which allow them to actually harness and communicate very complex ideas, which you might not get in a fundraising campaign. They're able to proceduralize social processes. So instead of it just being a visual representation, a photo, or a verbal representation through language, they proceduralize different social processes. And through that, you can actually, through these games, see some of the problems and challenges that refugees face, border control, when they have to answer certain questions. I mean, they're still in the really early stages, but just the idea of how video games tell stories and how we can use play as a way to learn more about disaster-affected people is something that I think we can look into a bit more. Anyway, next slide, because maybe I've got 30 seconds now. So this is the comic that I created with John C. Douglas, who's this amazing illustrator, and some of them are peppered around for you to pick up. And I decided to do this because, and Michael can talk about this a lot more because he's an illustrator, I really want to be able to bring through the personalities and experiences and voices and humour that people have even after a disaster like Hurricane Maria, which absolutely flattened Puerto Rico. But when I was writing a journal article, I was like, I'm not really doing justice to people's personalities here. So being able to draw, illustrate their stories through this different medium, through graphic illustration, allow me to really bring through the different personalities and different everyday, you might call mundane experiences that people had. So for me, I'm a real advocate of graphic illustration as trying to ground your research, but also making it accessible to the people that you're talking to. So I was able to go back to the people in Puerto Rico, give it to them, and they were able to understand like what on earth I've been doing for the last year, why I was talking to them. They understood what my research was about. 15 minutes? Perfect. All right, thank you.
Nice, loud voice. Hi, how's that? This is how I'm going to talk. I actually talk to the slides, so I think I've got more like 20 slides. Yeah, what roles for artists in a common disaster? It's a very good question. I made some notes, quite a few notes. More social economy, less work for profit, and more for public-private partnerships, I would think. I do know that art brings empathy and art brings people together. So, yeah, the pictures I'm going to show, I hope you get a little bit of that from these, but I guess there's a lot of questions. But yeah, the slides, this is a slide, it's from a series of recent paintings that I've done. And I guess as far as like going to the next slide, I'll make this gesture. My name is Michael Fikaris. I'm an artist who works with public art, illustration, and storytelling. So I work with galleries, I publish books under various styles, sizes, and names, and I collaborate a lot. And this is a slide from a recent show that I did, Dubita. This is a pretty bad set of photos showing a recent graphic novel I did with another writer, Nicola Gunn. I've also participated in a lot of different community art projects over the years. But tonight, I want to just speak about my work with East Timorese artists and getting to get a bit closer as possible to the questions that Gemma has asked us to speak about. So my story of working with people recovering from disasters pretty much began in 2010. It started at a studio and a gallery I was part of at the time, City Lights in Melbourne City. And the gallery hosted a show called Piece of Wall, Street Art from East Timor. The book and the show by this name were made by Chris Parkinson, an NGO worker, academic, and photographer based in East Timor from around 2001 to 2008. And for the show, he brought 3 artists from Timor to Melbourne as part of the launch for this collection of photos and installation in the gallery. I was an instant convert. This is a photo from the gallery, from Andy Mack. So yeah, I grew up doing graffiti, and it's something that was often known as the voice of the voiceless. This was a series of photos that really spoke loudly to me. And to quote Chris Parkinson from an interview about his book at the time in 2010, he said, "When you realize that conditions that inform this work, the history that is echoed through the street art and the perseverance of the country's quest for peace and harmony, it's just kind of fucking awe-inspiring that the impetus to create even exists." This says a lot, I think, about this subject, and I highly recommend the book, Piece of in the lane, and working together like this over the afternoon. We got to know each other and share some experiences as you do when you work together. How tight is that lane? 2010, how's your lane? This is the section that I painted that afternoon with my friends, Haha on the left with the stencil, myself, Braddock, I was calling myself at the time, and Monkey. We're all still good friends too, so it's kind of part of art and bringing people together. So yeah, eventually, thanks to funding, the Animatism Project brought 3 of the finest Timorese artists to Melbourne, and we did this piece together in Fitzroy in 2014. I say we, as by then I was part of Animatism Art, which is a group of academics, teachers, and artists that Chris Parkinson put together as an exchange program between Melbourne and East Timor. My first trip to Timor was actually back in 2013, where I spent 2 weeks at Arte Moris, the city lights of Dili, East Timor, if you like. We'll get to that. I skipped forward a bit because I thought this picture was kind of good. It actually won the award. It was part of Gertrude Street Projection Festival in 2014, and it won the Walker Abercrombie Judges Prize, which was good for some funds for the artists, of course, to go back to Timor. Next slide. That's the guys there. This is Tony, Elfie, and Edson, who I designed and painted that mural with. And Tony and Elfie there on the left now live in Australia, which is pretty awesome. Next slide, please. As part of the Animatism Project, I've learned about the recovery and the stories of disaster during the Indonesian occupation and the situations after the Portuguese left East Timor. This process pick that I took was after a week of teaching workshops on storytelling through murals, which is something I still do today, and planned these group designs for murals around the town of Dili, the capital city of Timor-Leste, where we were based to install many works for Arte Publicu, which was a large-scale public art festival celebrating the transformative power of art in a nation building a democratic discourse. Timor-Leste is the world's second newest nation, and this was the first time there had been city-wide celebrations of art and creativity. There's a great website about it, dilifestival.com, if anyone's taken notes or interested. But I guess that's why we're here, because I can talk to you more if you're interested in anything about Dili. Next slide is back in 2013. So this is back when I stayed at Arte Moris, and I chose to spend a week in this booth I made to invite young people in for a portrait and a feed. If they told me a story, I don't know if you can see this, there's 2 photos there, but on the left is the booth. You walk inside the booth, you see a sweaty dude seated with a pen and a paper who will draw you in a pose. And that's what the sign read in Tetum. But 5-minute sort of portrait. That's what you get if you come inside, and a feed. And I got to basically listen to a story. And most people, young people there were speaking English, or I would just listen to what they were saying. But often it was small talk about the food, which I'd gotten off the street, which was great stuff, get different stuff every day. But yeah, we talk about just a story. It became known as the Booth of Truth, because I was there for 6 whole days. So I got a lot of pics, a lot of stories, a lot of strong, sweaty memories. Actually the same room, you can sort of see the background there. It's a huge room, but the same main room there I was in was used as a type of makeshift hospital emergency space during the Indonesian occupation up until around year 2000. So that was the focus of a lot of stories. Many had not yet returned to this building since losing loved ones there. I don't know, I guess that's relevant. This is one of the guys. This is how I sort of work with people. But you can see a lot of portraits. I did a lot of portraits. I made a little comic book about it, Art as Life. It's mostly the research that I took, on this residency and the stories I heard. Art Timoris, it's the art school in East Timor. If anyone hasn't heard of it, it sort of translates to living art in Tetum, which says a lot, I think, on this subject. And so these are some pages from the book. There's a lot of portraits I did, and so I drew some of the important people about Art Timoris. Dr. Jose Ramos Horta, pardon my Australian, that's him on the left, who attained the building a few years after Timor gained its independence. And on the right, Luca Ganser, who he sort of restored the building. Him and his partner, I believe, spent a whole year physically restoring the 6 buildings that make the art school, which used to be a museum, I believe, before Indonesia came in. But over about a year they set this up, and the primary aim was to use art as a building block in the social and psychological reconstruction of the population. So to use art as a building block in the social and psychological reconstruction of the population. So there's a special emphasis on helping its young citizens, and this was really evident. So basically the school is just like a center that lots and lots of people go to. So art is, the center of so many things. Next slide. As you can imagine, I learned a lot about the history of the building and the people and the artists working there, and I helped out a bit. I even got some cool tattoos. I joined a gang. And so I'm part of Art Timoris too, a good gang, a garbage collecting gang, because everyone burns their garbage there, which was wild. Hard to sleep at night. It's actually a nice night here when I go back and think of hanging out at Art Timoris. So I drew everyone who was part of the school when I was there, and the book is about the school and how it was set up. And it also compares the life of me and my artist community from Melbourne to the artist community there in Timor. So this was kind of part of the exchange. It seemed like a good idea at the time. If anyone wants to read it, I've put it online, so you can ask me, I can give you a link or something. Moving to this one. One of the most touching and incredible stories I received at the Booth of Truth was from a man about my age, Osme Gonçalves. Pardon my Australian there again, probably bad pronunciation, Osme. But he's a celebrated artist and a singer, poet and actor, and a prominent ex-resistant fighter of the brutal 24-year Indonesian occupation that Timor suffered through 75 to 99. So this story, an accident, was translated over a few visits when Osme came to my Booth of Truth. Sitting with Osme and translated his stuff with the help of another Australian living there in Dili. This is the first chapter of 4 that I want to illustrate. Up here, this is a couple of pages from it, hastily put together for you guys to check out. But it's a mini comic. It's been published in a couple of different things, a few ways, but it tells the story basically of when Osme was 7 and he was wanting to go into town with his friends. and then an accident that occurs on the way, mainly the boys being captured and retelling of how they craftily escape. The next chapter, which I am still currently illustrating, is A Tale of Osme at 14. A similar creative outcome to Survival and Tales. So the plan is to illustrate his story at 21 and then at 28 during this whole time. By the time the occupation is over, there's these 24 years. And it's an incredible story, his story of survival. He's actually given me all of the words, I just haven't managed to do it all yet. So Osme is possibly the best version of someone who has used art as a tool in recovery from disaster on this subject. He's still recovering, actually, no doubt. The theatre company Black Lung worked with him on some beautiful and surreal productions. And there's some wonderful but harrowing films of his poetry on Animatism Art website. Did I already tell you about that? But you can look it up if you're interested. Which it's a great site. It's got a lot of stuff going on in there. But yeah, it's a fascinating story of survival in a disaster zone. Most of the other men his age didn't make it out and didn't survive through this violent time of the occupation of Indonesian military up until 1999. I'm a big fan of his work, and this talk has actually made me pick it up and start drawing it again. Because like I said, I did the first one, we sort of did a few things with it, but there's a lot of stuff to do. But I'm a big fan of his work, and Osme is a true artist, I reckon, and his retelling of creative survival techniques during the occupation, that was his life from the age of 3 to 27, is this first chapter. It's also available online if anyone wants to read it. It's been printed, like I said, a few times, but our dream is to have it supported as a larger book because it's excellent and it would make a great non-fiction graphic novel one day. So still got some more. Moving on. What do we got here? This is a pic of Alfie Tag in the front of the Australian consulate in Dili. About this time, this is 2017, the truth was out there regarding Australia's relationship to East Timor and the ongoing dispute of the Maritime Treaty. So the Timor Sea Justice campaign was in full swing, and many meetings were and still are happening to bring justice to the people of East Timor regarding the mining of natural resources in the Timor seabed. This shows again more creativity in a disaster. It's another disaster again, really, with Australia and Timor relationship, I think. Which is just that, blatant theft of land and the Australian government's refusal to admit that they changed the maritime border for profit. This photo was red for some reason, but it's kind of relevant to this, and it's from the show Mind the Gap. It was an exhibition I co-curated with Lindy Yeats here in Melbourne in 2017. This was in the eastern suburbs at the Maroondah Arts Centre. And she contacted me. I put together a section of my visual art friends from Timor to take part, which was about the same time Alfie and Tony were moving here to Sydney. This was great because it helped raise funds, and it was a different sort of audience on this. Lindy's one of 3 groups in Melbourne I've donated time and works for that mainly raise money for women's health in Timor, which is probably one of the bigger issues as well. But the other groups are in Ballarat and Box Hill doing great stuff. And this is me holding one of the sold portraits, one of those earlier portraits I showed you that I did in the Booth of Truth. And that's Alfie, that wonderful man there on my right in the picture. He actually just had a successful solo show here, his first show in Australia, Missing Threads at Black Dot Gallery, which is an excellent gallery in case you need to know more about galleries here in Melbourne. Got some more. This is a better picture. This is me looking like a chump, holding another portrait pointing to, this is pointing to a portrait here that Tony's done in the background, and this is from the gallery. This is Tony in the portrait that I'm holding, but it's his work behind me. The mural is The Sea of Change, and it relates also to the subject of the Timor Sea Justice campaign. This show was just in time for a documentary being made on the subject. I haven't included all the other things we did as part of this show. It was a really big thing. It was great at the Arts Centre there. So my next slide is my last slide, and it's an image from that documentary. So it was put together by Front Yard Films, who've done some really powerful stuff, and it has some incredible interviews and speakers, and I did another mural with some other Indonesian friends here in Melbourne. I really recommend it if you're interested in this subject. It's it's got a lot more discussion on this, you know, a lot deeper. That's it. That's what I got.
Okay, does anybody need to stand up and stretch, or are we good? Yeah. I guess we can start with that next slide there. Melinda, thanks. Hello, my name is Jenn Wray. I actually thought I'd start. I wear a lot of different hats, actually. I thought I'd start off with some images of some drawings as a segue from this sort of visual arts practice and working within a gallery space. So up until I think 2018, I was still producing work that was still in a gallery scene. This here is the Anthropocene trilogy, and I would do one drawing a year, and it was sort of a mnemonic device, a way of sort of taking in a lot of this sort of really complex stuff around climate change and configuring it into one drawing. So the first one was The Myth of Progress, the next one was The Bad Smell of Extinction, and then in 2018 I did When All Else Fails. So I made an active decision to leave the gallery space around that time. I felt that a lot of the work that I was doing was preaching to the converted. I was feeling that, I'd been working in climate change really up to that point about 12 years, and was starting to develop a real sense of anxiety around climate change, and really thinking, shit's gonna happen, what are we gonna do about it? And realizing that I didn't have very many survival skills. And so, in moving out of this space, it was around that time that I met Kate, that we were invited to come to Arts House to do this thing called Refuge. It was a creative lab. We didn't know what it was. Maybe we can just move to the next slide. And sometimes I do reflect that, if climate change didn't happen, if I go back 15 years, if it didn't happen, what would I be doing? Because so much of my work is so much of life and work is embedded within preparing for disasters and climate change related communication. So in 2015, Angharad Wynne Jones, who was the creative director at Arts House at the time, invited a group of 6 artists, Kate and myself being 2 of them, to come and do a creative lab. And in the creative lab, what it was they wanted to explore what the role of art was in the exchange and community art centers in terms of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. And what can we learn from artistic creative methodologies around communicating climate risk and preparedness? So if you ask anybody who's involved in Refuge, and there are, I think we're probably over 200 people who have been involved in it. There's a lot of collective IP to Refuge. Everyone will give you a different reading of what Refuge is. And so I'm just going to give you the little glimpse, but then I'm going to turn it over to a video that sort of really encapsulates it. But it's a 5-year transdisciplinary project that actually happens a block away from here in North Melbourne Town Hall every year. Since 2016. And it explores the roles of artists and cultural institutions in a time of climate catastrophe through multifaceted, context-specific disaster rehearsals. It aims to deeply engage communities around disasters by activating the imagination and building relationships. Arts and culture's contribution to disaster recovery is globally recognized, but Refuge, the premise is different. Through 3 components each year, which would be a creative lab, a free public rehearsal event, and a partner evaluation. Artists, elders, emergency services, such as the Red Cross, Save the Children, Ambulance Victoria, Emergency Services Victoria, and so on, with academics, government, and community work together to rehearse climate-related emergencies. In this space, we reimagine our needs, the way we care for each other, and the way we design emergency relief in the event of a disaster. So I'm going to hand it over to the video. If you Google Arts House Refuge, there's a lot of different collateral in terms of evaluations and videos and so forth. Oh, do we have to switch?
You rely on. It might be a stranger who's in the street beside you, or it might be your next door neighbour, but it's the people around you. And this, through talk and imagination, was the idea that kept on popping up amongst people. And leading them to reinforce their own confidence in each other.
Great. Some of you might actually know Lorna. She lives a block this way and about 3 blocks that way. Also a core artist in Refuge. So here we go. So how Refuge collaborators and partners navigate risk, public engagement and communication are vastly different. As Alison McMillan, Director of Emergency Resilience at the Department of Health and Human Services explains, one of the limitations and challenges of emergency communication is its failure to activate the public imagination to the potential risks and consequences of disaster, especially in urban context. So organizations and officials in emergency response have a duty and a reputation basically to provide safe and authoritative information to the public around crisis and risk. And we've basically developed a conditioned sense of reliance. So, I mean, one really good example would be when the head of ambulance, the outgoing head of ambulance Victoria came during the pandemic lab, and he basically, because he was leaving, just gave us all of the information about, what he experiences at the control center. And one of the things that he told us was that, do you remember the thunderstorm asthma event? During the thunderstorm asthma event, he opened up his laptop, and normally when an ambulance is dispatched around the city, a red dot shows up. When he opened up his laptop on that day, it was completely red, and he said he wanted to go and basically rock himself in the corner because he knew what that meant to the city, he knew what it meant to all of his staff, and he knew that this was not going to be a once-off event. And so because of that event, that idea about if an emergency happens that you can call 000 and somebody's going to respond, it changed that day. And emergency services have since then have changed that during a disaster and a crisis event, to not expect a response within 24 hours. And that's even moving up to 48 hours. So that means you're going to have to be more self-reliant and connected within your community. I've just been in the States. There's some cities that are saying 72 hours, and a project I just did in Vancouver, the city of Vancouver is saying 1 week in terms of being self-reliant. So, but risk and experimentation, on the other hand, are methods of practice-led research which the artists in Refuge employ in engaging audiences and participants with the subject matter and themes. So we actively ask emergency services saying, what's your no-go zone? What can we potentially play with here? As I mentioned, it began as an experiment. It continues to be an experiment. There's no model. Do you mind changing the slide there? Yeah, thanks. It's what we refer to within the project as playing in the dark. So each year we begin with a creative lab. It's 2 days with the project partners, 5 days with the artists. This is where we really try to understand the context of each year's theme. Everyone has their legs under the same table. That's something we refer to. So we privilege the expertise of everybody who's in the room. Integral to the project is that it's artist-led and it's ran by an arts organization that is, comfortable with managing complex projects. And really, it's understanding the context that determines the form. We're not replicating each year. We have to understand, what are the questions we're not asking, who's not in the room, what are the risks that our partners can't take, what is the plot, what are we practicing, what is the scenario. So as you could have seen in those 5 different themes there, the first 2 years we did a flood and a heat wave. We converted Arts House into a 24-hour relief center. In a pandemic, we wouldn't come together. So that made, changed the whole form of what we were making. So I'm going to close up on this year. So this is more of a project that I did within Refuge this year. It's also, it's a 2-year project. Disasters are a terrible time to learn new skills. It's the foundation of the project. What are the skills and knowledges that will be the most coveted in as the climate emergency begins to impact our local communities? Who can we turn to help? will we turn to those, our neighbors who can grow food, or those who we can call upon for first aid? There's actually now an app for that with the Red Cross because of recent events. Do we know will we be able to connect and collaborate with our communities, and how can we put our differences aside in a time of crisis? So are there any Canadians or North Americans here? No? Do you know what a portage is? No? It's carrying a canoe. It's over navigable waters. And so we've used portage as a metaphor in the project to consider it as a vessel of knowledge, and how can we work together within a crisis. And so there's 4 stages of portage. There's raft, flotilla, shelter, and camp. And so this year we really worked on raft and flotilla. So we had 100 people, mostly from refugee and migrant backgrounds from 4 of the housing estates close to Arts House. And we had 800 pieces of bamboo, 2 architects, emergency services, and we were raft building. And what it was about learning how to build, and we also partnered with Melbourne Museum and the City of Melbourne Park Rangers, and we're asking, can we grow building supplies that we might need in the future today? And so we're working with 6 intercultural Indigenous weavers. We did a walk within the grasslands to look at some of the medicinal, edible qualities of some of the plants and what could actually be used for building shelters next year. Let's see here. Maybe we can just switch to my last slide. How am I for time? Okay, all right. So, and then this here is Flotilla. So these are the rafts that we built. And it was an immersive installation. We don't have time to play the audio, but the audio is it's a 12-minute soundscape. It's a meditation to the sound of alarm bells, which sounds really out there, but there's these sirens and they start to go off, but you actually it taps into your binaural sound waves, or brain waves, sorry, and you actually end up meditating and feeling like you're floating on these rafts. So I'm going to hand it over to Kate now because we have a video between us. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. How's everyone going? Lots of listening. I'll try and be lively and keep it. So I'm primarily a theatre maker and a facilitator. I'm an artistic director of a company called Raucous, which is a company of artists with and without disabilities. But I also am a freelance artist as well, and that's how I found myself involved in the Refuge project. My practice is very, very collaborative. So the work I make is devised and created together with whoever I'm in the room with. So whoever I'm working with becomes a co-author and a co-deviser of the work. And I often find myself working and making art in community, often in marginalised communities and with non-trained artists. And I was just reflecting how interesting it is that I'm on this panel, because 5 years ago there's no way I would be talking on a panel, because the work I was making was quite different to this. And I think my work has started to respond to the idea of disasters because it's one of the most pressing things we face at the moment. It's really vital and urgent and hard to ignore. So that's how I found myself here. I think my work's always been interested in understanding and investigating big human experiences, what it is to be human. And most recently, I've become interested in how we as a community maintain hope. How do we care for each other? How do we stay connected? How do we endure and recover from trauma? And the last theatre work I made was really interested in this idea of hope and recovering. And it was really inspired by, I read a lot of Rebecca Solnit's writing, for those who know her. She writes a lot about hope, and she wrote a beautiful thing. Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty, there's room to act. And I think one of the skills we have as artists and as a theatre maker is to tolerate and work with the unknown. The ability to sit in that space and create something from nothing. And as Damien spoke on the video, that from the Red Cross, that gives us as artists different perspectives and the skill set to bring to the conversation around disaster and disaster management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about refuge and the projects that I've done, but I'm also going to talk about the latest work with Raucous, Song for a Weary Throat, which is a work about the aftermath. So you've probably got a lot of information about refuge, but so it's this collaboration between artists and emergency services, and most of my projects have involved the Red Cross and a partnership with the Red Cross. And that first year was really pivotal. We sat in a room with these, I didn't know anything really about disasters or disaster management, and we sat in this room and listened to people talking to us about who work in that space. And three things really struck out for me in that first lab. Susan Davis from Save the Children said, currently in disasters, animals are better cared for and planned for than children. Nearly everyone who spoke about the importance of hope and maintaining hope and how difficult that is to maintain. And the other thing that really stuck out to me was this other quote: the more victims of trauma are truly empowered, the more they'll move to survivor status, and this may be especially true of children. So these things kind of swam around in my head, and I wanted to create a project that addressed these, and in particular worked with young people, but saw young people as a resource, not something to be catered for or looked after. You know, young people have so much wisdom and knowledge and can be this amazing resource. So I created this project, and there's some slides and pictures of it. It was called Nest. It was quite a complex project, but the main thing was this cubby building activity in this refuge centre. So we had this imagined refuge centre, and in it, young people or anyone who came to the relief centre was invited to build a cubby. They had to register their cubby, they had to name it and tell us where it was located. And then there was a postal system, and you could send letters of hope or encouragement to people. So there was inter-cubby communication, there was the young people sent letters of hope to adults, and the adults could also communicate with the children. So we can just flick through some photos. This is the Red Cross delivering a workshop in one of the big central cubbies we made. But you know, these cubbies were all over the relief centre. You can just flick through them, and everyone named their cubby. You can just here we are. There's some cubby building things, and the postal service was run and managed by the Kensington Scout Group. So these young people. Here's the registration board. And so when people left, they let us know, and there were new owners who kind of came and took over the cubbies. This went over for the whole 24-hour period. Things were rehoused, and yeah. Here's the mailbox. And lovely bits of advice from there. So that was the first year. There's some more, yeah. That was the first year, so you get the idea. The second year, I worked with St Joseph's, the students from St Joseph's Flexible Learning Centre. For those, it's also a school just up the road, and it's a school for young people who are disenfranchised and disengaged from education. Most of the students there have faced a range of challenges: exclusion from mainstream education, poverty, disadvantage, mental health, child protection matters, and youth justice matters. It's a very complex group of students. And we were particularly interested in preparedness. How do you prepare for a disaster? So we took the Red Cross preparedness kit, which is all practical advice, you know, get your water and your paperwork. And together we made an alternative preparedness kit, an emotional grab-and-go bag. And so we talked about, so while the Red Cross says things like, so this is, I'll get you to hold that up. This is the Red Cross's Get Packing list, which is, you know, light, water, cash, food. And this is the St Joseph's preparedness kit that we made modelled on theirs, which were things like words of comfort. We made soundscapes. We looked at what qualities you had inside yourself that could help, and photos and things like that, and playlists. And we made an exhibition of those things. So we had this kind of beautiful thing that happened, and the Red Cross loved it so much that this year we ran a workshop together, and so they did all the practical things, and then we came and did the emotional preparedness based on these young people who had so much to offer about resilience and endurance. So it was a pretty beautiful project. We're welcome to have a look at that. So the other project that I wanted to talk to you that's not about refuge was this, the last show that Raucous made. There's an ensemble member of Raucous here in the audience. And Raucous has been around for 19 years. It's a long-term ensemble. There's 15 performers in the ensemble. And we make devised and original work together. And our last work was called Song for a Weary Throat. And it was a work about the state of the aftermath. And it was motivated by a desire to understand more about how people recover in a disaster. It asked, how do we get up after loss, trauma, heartache, and how do we maintain our hope? And the artists with disabilities, actually all the artists in the company, had much to contribute to a conversation about resilience and hope and endurance. And the work really became a work about how do we care for each other, how do we connect and maintain community. It was set in an abandoned dance hall, and really it was about how do we find the spirit to dance, both individually, together, and can we, after trauma. The work was a non-specific disaster. You could imagine yourself into whatever scenario. Has a lot of space for the audience to interpret, make connections, and read their own meaning from the imagery. It's a really visceral work, and maybe the best way is to just watch a little bit. It's just a 3-minute clip from the show. So Gemma asked me, what can theatre do to help us understand disasters? And I thought, that's a really big question. I'm not sure about that. But here's a few thoughts on what some things theatre can provide. It can provide a collective experience that people share in real time, and that's a really powerful thing. It can be a space for people to imagine themselves into an experience, which might be really important in terms of preparedness. It can be a space for reflection, a space for questioning, a space for imagining what if or what could be. It can be a space for dreaming up a new world or a different future. It's a space to challenge what's possible. And theatre is a space that can hold complexity. Multiple truths and realities can coexist on stage. In this work, some people recovered, some were permanently broken, and some people had a small version of hope. But, for me, theatre is an act of love, and I think we're going to need more and more acts of love as the challenges we face increase and become more complex.
What a note to end on. This has been a very, very powerful and provocative and thought-provoking panel. We have been going for some time, but I think it would be a real shame to stop before people have a chance to have some discussion with our panel. So let's take a few minutes. Please raise your hand if you'd like to respond to anything you've seen or ask any questions of any or all of our panel members. And maybe I'll just ask you at the front to keep your eyes peeled for hands going up. Otherwise I can come up. Let me start then while people are formulating their thoughts. And I'm not sure quite how to ask this question, but let me just kind of do it in a muddly way. How do you see the relationship between, can I just call it disaster art? Disaster art and art as critique. In other words, that the forms of critique that are still imagining a possibility where we just defer what's coming. I mean, one of the things that's so confronting to me in being here and because I've not been to refuge is the business of saying, it's here. What are we going to do about it? So I would just love to hear from the artists on the panel around that question, whether you see a seamless relationship and a flow between critique and practice-based response to disaster, or whether you see them as different kinds of modalities.
Rachel and I were having this conversation earlier before we came here a little bit, and I was always interested in the concept of outsider art. I don't know, so maybe there's a way that we make stuff as individuals or as a group that relates to something we need to do, that we're drawn to, as opposed to something that is possibly inspired by something similar, like an art form that exists and that sort of thing. That's my reflection on the question.
I remember when we were very first involved in Refuge, and Ang Harrod, who kind of visioned the whole thing, said, we're past the point of being able to do anything about it. We're now in preparedness phase. And kind of really jolted me into kind of a new reality, and it's like it made me think about the work in a really different way, and that it has to be about preparedness for what we're definitely facing. The prevention thing's well and truly past.
I occupy probably 90% of my brain space in this, wondering about time and what can we do, but also not sticking our head in the sand. We have, Peter, is it 11 years left from the IPC report, somewhere around there, possibly 18 months, I don't know. The iPhone came out in 2007, 2008. social media, Twitter and Facebook came out in 2006 and 2007. That's roughly 11, 12 years. If you think about how much those two things transformed our culture, our way of communicating on a global scale, that's what gives me hope, is that we actually can do this. It's just a matter about committing to it and connecting to it. So, that's where I find hope. But on the same token, my practice, everything we do at home, everything we do within our community is about building community resilience. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about grief? Because you mentioned love, which is important. I think the other thing is about how we create community forms of grieving, especially ritualised forms, because we don't have them. We don't have containers to hold. And the historical left has never engaged with this question. And I do think we need to start. How do we hold these? And Gemma is someone who does a lot of work in this area, being one person, but it's something we need to bring to the fore of the culture rather than the periphery.
And I mean, I do have a thought on that, but and I can't remember the woman's. She's a millennial. She wrote an article in the paper, and it had something to do with snapping out of it. We don't have time for this, and it's like I often ask people about what stage they're in Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, right? Because you don't stay in one, you move back and forth and so forth. But right now, I think we need a lot of action, and there's places to put grief, and it's a real thing, and we do need, we need to deal with that. We need to be angry, and we need to be angry at certain people, and we need to mobilize that anger. But on the same token, we need action. It took a lot of skills and knowledges, to get us to this point. It's going to take a lot of skills and knowledges to get us out of this point. So, yeah, I think there's a definite need for it, and definitely artists working in that space. So.
There's a big moment in Sunkaroo Throat, which was about grief. Yeah, it was really, and many people in the audience wept and wept.
I wonder if that's a theme of the Titan team or two that came up in your stories.
Yeah, but I guess everyone sort of has a different perspective on grieving, and depending on what you're grieving and stuff like that too. Obviously, traditions of grieving. The animatism present in Timor, which I really relate to and have such a fascination for, that concepts, the idea that a grain of sand is as relevant as ourselves sitting on the beach, that sort of juju is totally there. And when, I guess, I don't know if whether you're shocked by seeing dead people or you're related to something traumatic otherwise, like people when they're just walking have to say a prayer about things that might have died. It's also deep, personally. But yeah, it's definitely relating to my experience and working with people, the animatism element and the idea of a spirituality that goes before this concept of God and a higher power that maybe makes things happen, is that it's natural, and that sort of stuff is possibly just as happy as it is sad, or it's just a neutral understanding of this rock we're spinning on and stuff like that, maybe. That was a pretty deep question. But getting deep's good.
Thank you.
Look, thank you for the presentations. They were insightful and very moving. I work with a group called Climate, and I've been working with them for 8 or 9 years now. Jenn knows of them. And we've sort of been more or less doing reasonably conventional art in reasonably conventional spaces, gallery spaces, trying to work with the elites and those who may be transformed and moved by the art we've got. So I'll start with a comment that you made.
So when I think of art and disasters, a lot of the time I'm thinking about policymakers and people working in disaster risk management. And I just think that art, I know you're asking for critiques, but I think your question is more geared towards audiences, which I think Jen and Kate and Michael can speak more about. But I really think creative texts are something in which policymakers should be engaging with, because they communicate different experiences, different ideas, which could inform policy. So in terms of talking about audiences and how do we, are we desensitizing people to that? I don't know, I think other people on the panel can speak about that better, but I just think that policymakers aren't even trying to engage with these types of texts. And that I think regardless of desensitization, if they're working on policy, I think it's something that should be brought in as a way of reimagining. Well, I mean, maybe somebody else can comment on this idea of, do we think, yeah, the audience are becoming desensitized?
I mean, one of the videos there showed an Indigenous elder talking about millions of years of trauma and things. I'm kind of down with that, that it ain't that big a deal when we die, and it's happened many times, and death is kind of just a concept. But, you know, art in itself is part of this, and that's the enjoyable part. That's, to me, that's, you know, why I was wanting to talk, is that the idea of making art while you're here and having a good time and sharing it with others and sort of rejoicing in you know, something that you can do together is enough most of the time. And certainly, yeah, on the subject I was talking about, like people from a trauma of war, which is such a, you know, it's a 3-letter word that's so strange and hard to describe anyway. You just got to roll with it and maybe make the most of it, even if it might just be that one night that you can do something together. It's a song, or it's making a meal, or, you know, being creative and doing something with what you got. So that's kind of my feel on it. I really liked that, what you guys are doing, and that video was really, it's nice when you can, yeah, just be able to learn from other places, of course. It's one of the greatest things you can be part of, just listening.
You're asking about images, right? You're predominantly?
No, I think I go into
Performance, okay. Because, like, I mean, we do live in an ocular-centric world, right? And we are inundated with images. And I think from moving out of the gallery space myself, from that two-dimensional to the more experiential, we're not really talking about disasters in most of the work that we're doing, right? We're in a framework and we're imagining these sorts of things, but we're asking questions like, you know, how do you find comfort in these places? You know, even this whole idea about the raft building, we were doing all of the sorts of community resilience sorts of things without intentionally setting out to do that. You know, like we had shared lunches every day, and emergency services, head of police, you know, they're sitting alongside people who have done time on Christmas Island, you know, and we're sitting and sharing food together, and we're breaking down sort of barriers that otherwise wouldn't be able to break down. You know, we're learning skills. We're learning about, you know, grasses that are in our environment that can be used to cut an umbilical cord, or can, you know, be eaten. You know, and you know, there's all these sorts of things. So we're doing it without scaring people, right? And I think we're building those sorts of skills and imagining, but also feeling a certain connectedness and doing something. And sometimes doing something about it helps to limit the fear. You know?
Thank you. Yes, very, very moving and scary. So I've been in some very dissonant spaces over the last few days. One of them has been down at the IMARC blockade, where a lot of my comrades have been really brutalised by police protesting. And another one has been a paper today talking about narratives of urgency and stories, and how important stories are around maintaining radical hope, you know, staying afloat emotionally. And then your panel and the artworks that you're doing about rethinking about, you know, resilience and in disaster places. And the dissonance for me is, we know the first objective is to stop fossil fuel conglomerates emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is the first thing we have to attend to, surely. How do we address ourselves to that? So I'm thinking about that across these different spaces, and they feel dissonant, and I wonder if they could talk to each other a bit better.
That's a lot. I watched that SBS documentary the other night, the Third Industrial Revolution. Did you see that yet? Damn, check it out. It's really good. That was really good. I don't know. That's a lot. It's just good to sit in a room and talk, and generally talk. Just opening discussion. There's obviously a lot of stuff to unpack with the 2019 Melbourne, bubble Melbourne. Yeah, and what's going on downtown there at the acronym of prosperity and coal. Like, it's just crazy, isn't it? It's just ridiculous. And who's to think, that we would get to that where we are here with just that blatant black and white opinion, and we're supposed to be this young, smart, courageous country. It's just a joke. But yeah, watch that doco. I can't remember the scientist slash economist, but he's fascinating and he's very hopeful, and ultimately talking about the new internet and the idea of a shared economy of a human family that we all here surely acknowledge. But art is just like that. When you talk about it more, think about it, and when it comes through in something like that, like something you can digest and watch and hopefully show someone who might be even less turned onto it, it's exciting because it continues the discussion, but questions constantly.
Thank you all. That was fascinating. It was really interesting. I was in a way picking up on the question you just put up a minute ago about kind of art kind of acclimatizing us to the disaster. In a way, I felt that the work you presented, Jenn, which was we saw these workshops where people were learning skills, how to, as you said, use those grasses to tie the bamboos, to make the rafts that we'll be needing here in North Melbourne when the floods get to the Institute, right? And I was thinking, well, I mean, it's art when we have these sorts of interventions that are bringing, neighbours and people, but it would be policy if we had not merely the North Melbourne community in this particular postcode, but it would be policy if the kinds of people that you're talking to, Gemma, in a way we're able to kind of pick up on these skills and the need to sort of expand these things and sort of to require all of us and many of us to learn how to cut the grasses and use these sorts of things. So I was thinking there was a kind of potential shift there from art to policy, which kind of brought us back in a way to Gemma's intervention and her critique. Both a comment, maybe a question as well.
I mean, what we've really experienced with Refuge is that people working together, right? And with Refuge, we've had people leave at different times, key members of the team. And the project is now held outside of us, and everyone's holding it. And new people come in, and different expertise comes in. And really, I ultimately just think we just need to be able to work together and lean into difficult conversations. So much about climate change propaganda is about creating divisions and not allowing us to communicate with each other. I think if we communicate and see, that's the beauty of transdisciplinary collaboration in a project like Refuge, is that we're making new knowledge together. Right? It's an experiment. We find funding to do the projects. There's not a lot to lose, and everyone just sort of has the buy-in in. Well, at least we're doing something, and we're having fun doing it, And that whole thing. I mean, I've realized here that probably not everybody in the room is thinking about disasters. We use a term called disasterbation in Refuge, because we we crossed that threshold 4 years ago, right? You know, and I mean, that was a terrifying place where we actually said, okay, we're going there. We're going there. And I had a 5-week-old baby at that point, you know, and to go over that threshold at that point, it was terrifying. So, I mean, I do acknowledge that that's a place that people are in, but there's a lot of hope when we've got emergency services saying, you know, well, this is what you can do, and there's this app, and you can, you know, and they're just used to fact sharing and downloading on people. We kind of are like a filter that all goes through, and we try and make it meaningful, or try to create some sort of something that's meaningful and relational in what we do. But a lot of it is working with each other and figuring out how we do it.
Just from your experiences working in post-disaster spaces, even if it's a really long period of recovery or just short, do you find the voices of artists kind of silenced in those times just because of the chaos of the moment? Also, maybe from your experiences in the Caribbean or in Timor-Leste, are local artists silenced or more encouraged to come out of the woodwork and express some of the hardship that's going on?
It's pretty mixed in my experience. Certainly in Timor, and you know, I've only been there a few times, but yeah, I'm really interested and talking with people all the time, and I know a lot of people that go to Indonesia a lot and discuss the subject a lot, and there's definitely, you know, that there's just so many things to think about when we're talking about an emergency or problems that are happening. You know, I think I went to Sumatra a while ago with this project where it was working between two communities, a British-American mining company that had sort of employed us to be nicely related to the people that were kind of taking the resources from, and deal with the young people, and just, you know, through art, gently try and make sure that they realize there's not much difference as we all grow up together. But I kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, like, well, of course there's differences. There's a big fence between where people sleep, and of course it's creative and there's things, but the guys on the outside who don't have like education, which is kind of the big one that we're all wanting to, you know, that's what we all need really, is just knowledge and time to be able to be thoughtful and process things that we can understand. And the other side has absolutely so much. You know, each kid has all these resources and things around them that it's just kind of bewildering. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the artist is in some way a soft handshake for bigger things in that capacity. That's how I felt a little bit used, like, oh yeah, but when have I not been in that position as an artist ultimately? Like, I didn't go to art school and stuff because as I was young, I'm like, what a crock. But most artists do want to sell something to the wealthy, or however you want to look at it, and you know, whatever you spend that money on is up to you. What it might be education, might be sharing that in a great way, you know. But certainly in Timor, I could say about that Arte Publicu, which was quite a big deal, and a lot of people got behind it, but it was a similar feel, but it's an incredible place. There's just like that feeling of a new democracy. It's just like, I've just never experienced anything like it. People are so passionate, and people work just like, you know, so many things, like 12 hats. It's not even like a concept of like what the role is, but just people doing so many things to get this art into place, which is basically a discussion, which is basically go out there and say like, this is how I feel, and you feel like that too, and that, you know, just people are like this everywhere in the world. The outcome is that the government didn't take it seriously in any way. They still didn't give any public art. It got to be taken back. It didn't get left in the streets. When I'm talking about installations like sculptures, or, you know, there's lots of things, like there was toilets that were hired by Australian and American groups that were supporting it, but then the toilets were taken away after the festival, which is like, but there's no public toilets. So, you know, women can't walk around in the streets. It's still like a post-war environment. So it's just like, wow, the artists are celebrated for a couple of weeks, and then it just becomes, yeah, business as usual, which is kind of like, I guess, the theme of what we're feeling here right now in Melbourne, where we're so educated and we've got all these things we can do, but like, what?
A quick answer, not from an artist perspective, but the research shows that after, it's talking more about theatre actually, so it's more related to Kate's work. In post-disaster context, or in conflict zones where actually there's an ongoing conflict, the amount of theatre production, it doesn't reduce, it doesn't increase, it just stays constant, just to show how important theatre production, art, being creative is in those contexts. And then there's also an idea that, you know, art is, you know, cathartic, it's therapeutic. There's often that assumption that people have that in a post-disaster context, people start being more creative. But actually, that may be so, but oftentimes in Puerto Rico, where I've worked, it's a very Eurocentric way of looking at it, that you should be creating, you should be opening up, you should be talking about your trauma. But actually, in a lot of cultural contexts, people, they don't want to express their grief, they don't want to talk about it or communicate it in that way. So I think it's often there's an assumption that people will become more creative and start expressing themselves in that way. But it depends really in the cultural context that you're talking about.
One last question over here.
Oh, what a pressure. That was an excellent. Oh yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. Thanks very much for those conversations. It was really interesting, and I really appreciated your theoretical opening up of the panel. And I kind of wanted to jump off a question from over here and from behind about how we turn these interventions into sustainable practices. And I think refuge is a really compelling example of how art can intervene and create these community-based engagements. And because refuge is an ongoing sort of durational piece, and you mentioned evaluations of it, I wondered what you're learning in terms of what makes this work in North Melbourne. Is it replicable? Could you do it elsewhere, and could it be longer and more sustained? Yes.
I can definitely talk to that. So it's not a model. And we do say that it's not something that you can replicate. We started with a localized flood. What we found out in that creative lab was that if a disaster strikes North Melbourne, and this is very important for you guys, North Melbourne is your designated disaster relief centre, for real. North Melbourne Town Hall. It is the designated. So that's where everyone will go. So and then we expanded it and in Heatwave, where we started working with regional communities, and then and it's expanding, but it's still within the context of North Melbourne Town Hall. However, I've been working with Marie Grenfell from, she's the Deputy Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Melbourne, and we've gone to Vancouver to do a creative resilience lab using refuge as a case study. And the work we're doing is built into their resilience strategy for the city. And so for 2 days, what we did is we taught the methodology, we presented the methodology, we tried the methodology, and then we handed it over. And we are now basically sitting there as, giving input, but they're generating their own projects now. And it's not necessarily refuge, because it's not context specific to Vancouver. They're looking at shocks and stressors related to sea level rise, earthquakes, an opiate crisis, homelessness crisis, high cost of living, and so forth. So their disasters are very different. And what we know from refuge is that every disaster is different and every response is different. So.
All right, obviously this discussion could go on for a great deal longer, but I think it's probably a good time to pause, invite you all to come and share a glass of wine and have a more of an informal conversation with our wonderful panel members. For those of you who don't know anything about the Institute, please check us out online. Please come back again. We are predominantly run on a voluntary capacity, so please do come and have a glass of wine with us, but please make a contribution to cover the cost of your wine. So next time you come, we can offer you some more wine. We'd really appreciate that. So join with me in thanking our panel. It's been a really fabulous discussion. Thank you.